Hi, I'm Mary Ellen Large, and I am with Nicholson Construction, and I am the co-chair of the Structural Slurry Walls and Seepage Control Committee. Welcome to the DFI Podcast.
Okay, welcome DFI Podcast listeners. This is another episode of Deep Dive. This is our podcast where we look at technical topics and we go a little bit deeper than the surface, hence the name Deep Dive. Today, I have the honor of having Tayler Day as my guest. A little bit of introduction. Tayler completed his PhD coursework under Dr. Eric Lohr at the University of Missouri. He worked for Dan Brown Associates for what, 5 years?
Yeah, I think so.
5 years. And he is now a senior engineer with UES. And Tayler's day-to-day is pretty hard design, isn't it?
Yep. I'd say 99%.
It's probably not day-to-day. It's probably day, night,
Day, night, day, yeah.
Okay. All right. So you get the picture. How many geotechnical reports do you read in a week?
I don't know, 20, 25 probably. I mean, we see a lot. Same with you guys. I mean, every project that we see, that we bid, that we work on, we review the geotech reports.
All right. So all you geotechs out there, remember, you're writing a report and this is the guy that's reading it. Today, our topic is Modulus of Subgrade reaction. And for me, this has been almost a constant thorn in my side as I read reports and I hear it being implemented, and even going back to when I first started as engineering, of what this means. What is this value? And so today, with Tayler's help, we're going to dig deep and look at this, and hopefully we're going to share some information that'll help you in your day-to-day work. Let's start with a little bit of a definition. Tayler, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, so I think the simplest explanation of the modulus of subgrade reaction, I think people, even the term itself is kind of misused and changed and altered constantly. But the general idea is that there is a compressibility value that's based on the applied stress and the resulting deflection. You divide those out and you get a number that's in typically pounds per cubic inch. So PSF divided by the deflection, you get PCI. And so, yeah, the value is meant to represent how stiff the response is going to be under a given load for a given foundation.
So when I think, I'm kind of a guy that, and I've told you this before, I think in cartoons.
Yeah. That's
what I think of. And the cartoon that I would think of is that the mod sub reaction is kind of like a funnel.
Okay.
And you've got two funnels that are the small end to end. And on one end, you've got the size of you've got the soil layers, you've got the soil compressibility, you've got the stresses in the soil, and you've got all these different considerations, and you've got to narrow them down to one number.
Yep.
That's the mod sub reaction. On the structural side, you've got mat stiffness and loading rate. And that all gets funneled down. And it also...
two magic school buses coming together.
And they come together and they both funnel down and they come up with a modulus of subgrade reaction, which is a stress applied and you get a displacement.
Yep.
And you hope the two coincide.
Well, they have to for it to be the real
reason.
Yeah.
Real.
Yeah.
If they don't, your solution is not valid.
Correct.
Okay. And most of the time, when we write a modulus subgrade reaction for design, we have no idea what the structural side of it is.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest issues is that, you think about, I always think about, you also taught me to think in cartoons. And so the cartoon I always relate everything to is the project life cycle, right? Like, you bring it back to like, how does a bill get made, and sing songs with your cartoons. But in the project life cycle, there's always the geotech report comes very early, usually environmentals first. You're doing phase ones and all that stuff. Then the geotech report happens, and it's basically a developer or an owner says, I have this site, I want to build this thing, can I build it? And that's usually the only information that they have. And so the geotechnical engineers coming in, doing some exploration, saying, sure, you can, that famous line that I think 90% of geotech reports have, based on our understanding of the loading and the plan development can proceed, provided the following recommendations are implemented. But at that point, there's usually just a really conceptual idea of what, there's going to be a basement or there's not going to be a basement. There's not, what's the foundation type? They can't do that until they have recommendations from the geotech on how to support the building. And so when you're that early in, there's no way to have all the information for the left funnel.
So you never hear that discussed, right? There's always this discussion as if communication was perfect and you knew everything.
Absolutely.
And like the structural engineer, when he got to his stuff, the idea is that, and that really goes into our next topic, and that is the state of practice.
Yep.
And the reality of it is, as we move to the state of practice, is right now, the geotech writes a report early on.
Definitely.
And for whatever reason, we feel the need, I think we all have felt it, to have all the answers before any of the details have come out. So we give a number, and then the structural engineer, he doesn't think to pick up the phone and say, and I'm not criticizing him, but they can pick up the phone and call, hi Tayler, I'm designing my mat or my thickened slab, and I see your modulus of subgrade reaction. Can I give you the stresses?
Yeah, never.
That didn't happen.
No, it's
Or my
basically it's basically siloed, right? So I think being on the design side, and I know you know this from your involvement throughout your career and committees and all these things, is that there are certain values in a geotechnical report that are just kind of ignored in design, I would say. And then there are certain values that I think are used way more than people think, right? And I think from the structural engineers that I've interacted with and some of the issues that have popped up with this, I think it's pretty clear to me that the two primary things that are coming out of the geotech report that the structural is just going to pick and use without thinking about it are the site class, the seismic site class, and the modulus of subgrade reaction. And they're taking that value and they're taking it all the way to ground with no interaction from the geotech.
No question. And I guess, where do we see the modulus of subgrade reaction discussed in the geotech reports?
So it varies company to company. I mean, everybody's kind of got their own setup, but typically there's some foundation recommendations, whether that's shallow foundations, deep foundations, and the recommendations usually come after site assessments and all those things where they discuss what types of soils and all these things, and then there will just be a line in there that says for shallow foundations for structures or slabs can be designed using a modulus of subgrade reaction of 100 PCI. And that's it. That's one line.
That's it.
And there's no qualification on that. Sometimes I think even over my career, it's kind of morphed a little bit from, you can use 100 PCI that's based on a 1 foot by 1 foot plate and it needs to be scaled up, to then that became it's 100 PCI for a 3 foot by 3 foot plate that needs to be scaled up, to just the modulus of subgrade reaction is 100 PCI.
Yep, I get that. I mean, I went back and looked at some of those reports, and I've seen anywhere from 50. I remember writing geotech reports, and 150 PCI, which comes down to about 21,000 PSF per inch.
Yeah.
Was the
so that's a super important point to me, is that I think the biggest disparity I see is that this may come either right before or right after a section where the geotechnical report says if you prepare things this way, you can expect an inch or less of settlement in your footing, and then very shortly after it will say the modulus of subgrade reaction is 100 PCI.
I agree. And then suddenly you're at 14,000 PSF.
Yeah. And no one expects those loads, and no one expects those deflections. I think the settlement estimates, I think geotechs are pretty comfortable understanding the variability and the unknowns related to the settlements that they're calculating or recommendations for settlements they're giving. But there doesn't seem to be a connection between that concept and modulus of subgrade reaction.
And don't you think part of it is that when we look at where the modulus of subgrade reaction is applied, it's a spectrum. We've got on one hand, on the far, let's say far my right, your left, for viewers, it would be, pavements,
Yep.
small wheel loads, forklift traffic, okay, whatever. And then we get probably a little more complex. We might get like a machine foundation. And then far on the other side, you'd have an actual mat between a major structure.
Yeah.
And, off the cuff, throwing out 150, a tank somewhere in there too. 150, 100 without consideration for the rate of loading, without considering the size, the layering of the soil. In fact, if you look up, in a textbook, they'll say sand 150 PCI, clay 100 PCI, and it's like, why did I ever go to grad school? I could have just looked it up here. So give me everything I need to know. And we're real, so I guess it looks like, where do we find? How do we determine and who's gone before us to say, are we making too light of the mod subgrade reaction, or is it one of those things that doesn't matter?
Yeah. So I've had conversations,
because it really can't be. It's got to be one of those two, because it seems to me like we're just throwing darts.
So
at reality,
I've had this specific conversation recently within the last 2 weeks, where I pointed out that we would never estimate the settlements to be on the order. You talk about increasing the load to get 1 inch for 100 PCI. I look at it the opposite way. If we have a 4,000 PSF bearing stress, what is that calculated settlement? Because I think that's easier to understand. And it's like, well, if I told you that, 4,000 PS, and I'm not doing the math in my head right now, but say a normal bearing stress was going to result in less than 1/10 of an inch of deflection, there's not a geotech that would ever write that in a report, right? And there's not a designer that would ever write that on plans. We would say 1/4 inch or less, or 1/2 inch or less. And so I bring this up and I say, well, this value is too high. This value for this particular structure needs to be reduced. And I had a structural engineer say, well, sure, the math may say that, but how many slabs have problems? How many foundations are we seeing distress or failures because of this value that we've been using under every structure?
Hey, that's a legitimate,
fair question.
Fair question.
And I think there's a few ways to look at that. I think that defining what the actual loading area is and the stiffness of the actual foundation on the structural side, I think they're a little bit conservative with some of that stuff. And I think that on the geotech side, we probably do a better job of prepping the surface for standard standard slab foundations or mat foundations than we would ever account for in a settlement calculation.
You're getting a little ahead of us, but we're gonna come back to that. I just recently had a project, and get your thoughts on this. I just ran a project where they wanted ground improvement, and they said, they gave us a modulus subgrade reaction to target. They said, we want 125.
I just had one like this too, like a month ago.
So that's kind of one of those things that, like a uniform modulus subgrade reaction between the entire structure.
That's a whole nother, there's concepts in there that it could be a whole nother deep dive about ground improvement and uniformity of bearing conditions and all these things. But yeah, I've been through the same thing and
with a bunch of different pressures, right? So you got all these different pressures, and they want a uniform modulus subgrade reaction.
And I think it's important to point out why, right? We kind of skipped over that a little bit. I think this value is being used as the only geotechnical input for the structural design of foundations. And for the most part, in a lot of structural, so like a mat calculation, they have to support the bottom of their foundation to calculate the bending moments and the deflections and all that. And they don't have complicated geotechnical models. And our geotechnical models aren't meant to be extended to structural calculations for the most part. Very, very in-depth models can be, but so the structural engineer likes this value because it's a direct input into the structural engineering software. And we all use software. We all love software.
It's not going anywhere.
Right.
Let's just say that it's basically, it allows him to connect his structure to a spring.
Yes.
And that spring have a value.
Absolutely.
Now, throwing another one at you about the state of practice. Had a project. The geotechnical engineer on the site gave subgrade modulus values, but they didn't consider the loading rate.
Okay.
So they got, obviously, they basically used the load test.
Yeah.
And so the criticism that came from the structural engineer is, oh my God, this thing is much stiffer than I expected.
Yep. Yeah. And so geotechnically, right, when you say that, the first thing that comes to mind is, when you think about piles or you and I do a lot of ground improvement, we think about the concept of piled rafts or, what is your settlement mechanism long term? And so if we're over soft clay deposits or we're doing long-term consolidation, secondary compression, those things aren't measured in a plate load test or a pile load test. Those things aren't measured and aren't reflected in the long-term actual deflection of the foundation.
Even just considering loading rate, you really got to break it up.
Absolutely.
Because you're looking at a mat or especially something with a substantial dead load, and if it has seismic load, the dead load's going to be a much softer response than the transient earthquake.
For sure. You could have a building that's halfway through its primary consolidation and exposed to an earthquake, and you think about how complicated the settlement estimation is after that. You're going to have short-term undrained loading, generation of pore pressures. Where do we go on the consolidation curve after that? There's a lot of things to unpack there. It can get as complicated as you want to make it.
It was rough. And I'll tell you this because the project I'm thinking of, it was a mat, and they ended up, the geotechnical engineer ended up doing some modeling. But in the modeling, they still put they did a very sophisticated numerical model, but they still put the stiffnesses in as if they were from the load test.
Yep.
And then they're putting in sustained loads. And you can see that they got a very sophisticated model, but it was the K value, was the stiffness that get through them.
I mean, and it sounds like we're picking on geotech, right? And I've seen
I'm picking on myself. Because I went through the same thought process.
So I've seen the one that I had recently that asked for a target modulus of subgrade reaction was actually the opposite. It was a fairly lightly loaded mat that had some industrial equipment on it. Nothing that was going to be severely dynamic, but the structure was very concerned about needing that stiffness. And when I looked at the structural design, it's a 36-inch thick mat with like 2,500 PSF bearing. The stiffness of that mat had me absolutely not concerned at all about the modulus of subgrade reaction, but I'm not a structural engineer. And so I guess we all make what we think are conservative assumptions. And what I found in my career is that what's conservative on the geotech side is not always conservative on the structural side, and vice versa. And so understanding what they're doing with it and when we have to pick a value, what does it mean if we don't know the value and we have to pick a value, we're likely going to pick something we think is conservative. If we pick something that's conservative, is it really conservative?
And that's the frustrating thing. It's very linear with bearing pressure.
Yep.
The lower it is, the more conservative, the higher it is. But when we're talking about subgrade modulus, it just changes everything.
Yeah.
Load distribution.
Yeah.
Anyway, I hope that what we have done is we've deconstructed a little bit the mod subgrade reaction to realize that it's frankly, it's a fictitious number that is meant to communicate between the geotechnical engineer and the structural engineer. It's not a property.
No.
And you know, the idea that we've got canned values of 150, 100, they have some history to it, and we're going to talk about those.
Yep.
But the reality of it is, we're always wrong.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
That's a scary thought,
trying
right?
to find one number that approximates a very specific amount of different specific numbers that are specific to a problem. And we try to apply, and we seem to apply the same number no matter what the properties are of the loading or the soils.
All right. Well, let's do this. Let's take a break. We've talked about the state of practice. We kind of talked about this. We kind of deconstructed it in the next half, the second half.
Yep.
Let's go through a couple of, let's say, monumental movements or advances in the concept, and then kind of talk about what every geotechnical engineer needs to know going into it.
I'm not sure we're the right people to give them that. But we'll try.
We'll give it a shot.
Yeah, we will.
Never stopped me before. And I haven't had one lesson. All right. Thanks.
Hello and welcome. My name is Sebastian Guerrero with the DFI Podcast Committee. We are celebrating our 4th year. This is also our 6th or 7th season. We need to double check on that. And we are having this new series, which is called Interview with the Industry. It consists of 3-minute short interviews going around the world, showing what our industry has to offer. I'm a consultant, so I'll be covering that aspect, and here is the rest of the team.
Hi, I'm Morgan Neesmith, and I'll be coming at this from a foundation contractor perspective.
Hi, I'm Lucky Nagarajan. It will be geostructural and products and women-in foundations as well.
I'm Tim Siegel. I'm a geotechnical designer.
And I'm Chris Woods. I'm a ground improvement contractor. We hope you enjoy the new season.
Excellent. It's a wrap. Good. Yeah.